The young and the restless spoiler's shock. The shock of discovering the truth about his parentage has set Nick Newman spiraling into a world of confusion and disbelief. For years, Nick has accepted the idea that Victor Newman, his father, had raised him and provided him with everything he needed. He had taken pride in his family legacy, despite the tension that seemed to hover over him whenever he was around Victor. But now, a letter from Aristotle Dumas, a man Nick barely knew, had shaken the very foundation of his identity. The words on the page were simple, yet powerful, suggesting a truth so dark and unimaginable that Nick couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to him. Nick stared at the letter, his eyes scanning over the carefully chosen words, the elegant script that seemed to mock his every thought. It spoke of a long-hidden truth, one that could change everything he thought he knew about himself and his family. The letter confirmed what Aristotle had been hinting at for weeks: Nick was not Victor's biological son. Instead, the truth was far more complicated. Nick, the man who had fought for his place in the Newman family for years, was the son of Aristotle Dumas, a powerful and ruthless man with ambitions far beyond what Nick had ever dreamed. At first, Nick could hardly believe it. How could this be true? Victor had always been his father in every way that mattered. He had raised him, trained him in the art of business, and had made him a part of the Newman legacy. Yet the more he read Aristotle's words, the more the gravity of the revelation sank in. Aristotle spoke with a cold certainty, as if he had been waiting for this moment all his life. Nick had heard of Aristotle, of course. The man was a powerful figure, one who had built his own empire from the ground up. But Nick had never once considered that he might share blood with such a man. The very thought seemed impossible, as if the world had tilted on its axis. But as the days passed, Nick began to question everything. His entire life had been built on a lie, and now, he was faced with the uncomfortable truth. He had never truly belonged to the Newman family, at least not in the way he had always thought. The truth hit him like a ton of bricks. His entire identity had been a lie, one built on the foundation of a false paternity. He had spent his whole life struggling to win Victor's approval, to gain his father's affection, only to learn that the very man he called his father might not even be his biological parent. The betrayal was deep, and the wound it left was raw and painful. But the revelation didn't end there. Aristotle, ever the manipulator, had a plan. He didn't just want Nick to accept his true heritage. He wanted Nick to take action. Over the course of several days, Aristotle bombarded Nick with messages, pushing him to embrace his new identity and take control of his destiny. The messages grew increasingly persuasive, almost obsessive in their tone. Aristotle didn't just want Nick to acknowledge the truth, he wanted him to act on it. The plan was simple, yet chilling. In exchange for Nick's loyalty, Aristotle would help him take down Victor and seize control of Newman Enterprises, the very empire Nick had always dreamed of inheriting. The offer was tantalizing. For years, Nick had fought to prove himself worthy of the Newman name, only to be met with rejection and disdain from Victor. No matter how hard he worked, no matter how many sacrifices he made, it seemed that he could never escape the shadow of his father's expectations. Victor had always favored Adam, the son of his first marriage, and even Victoria, who had always been the golden child. Nick, on the other hand, had always felt like an outsider in his own family. The resentment had festered over the years, and now, with the truth of his parentage revealed, Nick felt the pull of revenge like never before. But even as Aristotle's words echoed in his mind, Nick hesitated. The thought of killing Victor, the man who had raised him, was repugnant. How could he possibly betray the man who had given him everything? Yes, Victor had been harsh, even cruel at times, but he had also provided for Nick in ways that no one else could. Victor had been his mentor, his father, his protector, even if their relationship was complicated. To murder him, to betray him in such a brutal and final way, seemed unthinkable. And yet, as Aristotle painted a picture of a new future for Nick, one where he could finally take control of his life and his legacy, the temptation grew stronger. Nick's mind was in turmoil. The years of mistreatment, the feelings of inadequacy, the constant sense of being overlooked, all of it came rushing to the forefront of his mind. He had spent so much of his life trying to live up to Victor's impossible standards, trying to win his approval, only to be constantly rejected. Now, with Aristotle offering him a chance to take everything he had ever wanted, Nick found himself questioning everything. Was it possible that he had been wrong all along? Was Victor really his father, or had he just been a means to an end in Victor's grand design? As the messages from Aristotle continued to flood his phone, Nick couldn't shake the feeling that he was being pulled into something darker. Aristotle was a man of power and influence, but he was also a man who had no qualms about using others to further his own goals. Could Nick truly trust him? Was this all just another scheme to use him as a pawn in a larger game? Or was this, finally, his chance to take control of his destiny and claim the legacy that had always been denied to him? Days turned into weeks, and Nick's internal struggle continued to grow. He couldn't bring himself to confront Victor directly. The thought of looking into his father's eyes, knowing the truth, was unbearable. And yet, as the days passed, the pressure mounted. Aristotle was growing impatient, his messages becoming more forceful, more demanding. Nick knew that he couldn't stay in this limbo forever. He had to make a decision. In the end, it was the pain of years of rejection that finally pushed Nick to make his choice. He had never felt truly loved or accepted by Victor. The man had always seen him as a disappointment, a failure in the shadow of his other children. Nick's rage boiled over as he thought about all the times Victor had made him feel inferior, all the ways he had belittled him and cast him aside. If Victor wasn't his true father, then perhaps it was time for Nick to forge his own path, one that was free from the burdens of the past. But as Nick finally made his decision, he realized that the road ahead would be anything but simple. The choice to betray Victor, to embrace Aristotle as his true father, would come with consequences that Nick could not possibly foresee. The web of lies, deceit, and betrayal that he was about to step into was more dangerous than anything he could imagine. Aristotle was a man who took what he wanted, and he had no intention of playing by anyone's rules. Nick had already lost so much, his family, his identity, but now, he was about to risk everything for a chance at power. As he prepared to take the next step, Nick knew that the consequences of his actions would ripple through the entire Newman family, and the fallout would be catastrophic. But the question remained, would the truth, the one that Aristotle had promised him, set him free, or would it destroy everything he had ever known? Nick knew one thing for certain, there was no turning back now. The road to power was long, and it would be paved with blood, betrayal, and pain. But for Nick, it was the only road left to take. The empire he had always dreamed of was within his grasp, but at what cost? The final decision would be his. Nick sat in his office at Newman Enterprises, staring blankly at the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The world outside was bustling, yet he felt like he was trapped in a personal storm, one that threatened to tear apart everything he had ever known. For years, he had worked tirelessly, pushing himself beyond limits, always striving for the one thing he had wanted more than anything, control of Newman Enterprises. But that coveted position had always been out of reach, reserved for others, Adam, with his charm and cunning, and Victoria, with her unshakable loyalty to Victor. Yet here he was, the eldest son, the one who had sacrificed so much for the family, still relegated to the sidelines, never considered worthy of the top position. Nick couldn't help but ask himself, why? Why had he never been given the chance to prove himself as the rightful heir to the empire that was supposed to be his? As the eldest son, he was entitled to the role of CEO. And yet, it was always Adam or Victoria who were chosen. Always the same pattern. Victor had made his preferences clear, Adam, the chosen one from his first marriage, and Victoria, the golden child he could always count on. But Nick, despite his loyalty, despite his years of hard work, was left out in the cold. It gnawed at him every day, but today, the pain of that rejection felt unbearable. It wasn't just frustration, it was a feeling of utter betrayal. The realization hit Nick like a punch to the gut. Why was he being treated like this? Why was Victor, his father, so blind to his potential, so dismissive of the sacrifices Nick had made for the family? The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. Victor had never seen him as truly his son. Nick had always been the outsider, the one who couldn't quite measure up. In a twisted way, Victor's treatment of him made sense now, given the possibility that he wasn't even his biological father. If that were the case, it would explain the coldness, the lack of respect. After all, Victor had always treated Nick as if he were an afterthought. The idea that he might not even be Victor's son cut deeper than Nick cared to admit. And that was where Aristotle came in. Nick had always heard the rumors about Aristotle Dumas, the powerful businessman with far-reaching influence. The man was a legend in his own right, and now, Nick was learning that he might be his flesh and blood. As much as Nick hated the idea of accepting this truth, the more he thought about it, the more it felt like it might be the key to everything he had been yearning for. His chance to finally step out from Victor's shadow. To finally show the world. And Victor, that he was worthy of the power he had been denied. Aristotle's offer was tempting. It was more than just a business deal. It was a lifeline, a promise that Nick could finally claim his birthright, a chance to seize control of his future. All he had to do was take down Victor. The thought of murdering the man who had raised him, who had shaped him into the person he was today, was repugnant at first. But as the days wore on and the pressure mounted, Nick found himself beginning to question everything he had believed. Wasn't this what he deserved? He had been overlooked, undervalued, and rejected by the very man he had given everything to. Victor had never truly seen him as an equal, always treating him like the son who just didn't live up to expectations. Now, with Aristotle offering him a chance at power, Nick found himself torn between the life he had always known and the possibility of something greater, something that could reshape his destiny. As the tension inside him built, Nick couldn't deny the exhilaration he felt. This wasn't just about business anymore. It was personal. It was about proving to himself and to the world that he wasn't the weak link in the family. That he wasn't the failure that Victor had always believed him to be. Nick had spent years chasing after approval that would never come, and now he realized he didn't need it. All he needed was the power to claim what was rightfully his. The more he thought about it, the more Nick realized that his anger towards Victor had been building for years. It wasn't just the lack of respect, the feeling of being cast aside in favor of Adam and Victoria. It was the deeper wound, the one that came from being treated like an outsider, someone who didn't truly belong. Victor had always made it clear that Nick was not his true heir, that Adam was the one he trusted, the one he believed had the potential to lead. But Nick had always been the one who fought for the family, who stuck by Victor even when it was clear that the feeling was not mutual. That betrayal, that rejection, stung more than anything else. In the quiet of his office, as Nick paced back and forth, he realized something profound. Victor's treatment of him had never been about his abilities, his loyalty, or his worth. It had always been about something deeper, something Nick had never fully understood. If I'm not really his son, then what am I to him? The question echoed in his mind like a mantra. And now, with Aristotle's revelations, Nick was beginning to piece together the puzzle of his life. He had been manipulated, discarded, and never given the chance to thrive. But all of that could change. Aristotle is offering me the chance to take control of my future. All I have to do is accept who I truly am. The idea of killing Victor was still repulsive, but the temptation to take what was rightfully his, to prove to himself and to the world that he was more than just a son left in the shadows, was powerful. Nick had always been the one to clean up Victor's messes, to fix what others had broken. But now, it seemed, the opportunity to truly rise above it all was within his reach. All it would take was a decision, a single, dangerous decision that would change everything. As the days wore on, Nick's resolve began to harden. He couldn't ignore the truth any longer. If Victor wasn't really my father, if I'm not really a part of this family, then I have nothing to lose. The weight of this realization settled on him like a cloak. Aristotle's plan began to make more sense, and Nick could see how it all could unfold. He could rise to the top, claim what had always been his, and take control of Newman Enterprises. And he could do it without the baggage of Victor's legacy holding him back. But even as the allure of power drew him in, Nick knew that there would be consequences. The moment he took that step, there would be no turning back. The battle for Newman Enterprises would be a bloodbath, one that would cost him his family, his moral compass, and perhaps even his soul. But as Nick looked out at the skyline, he couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement building inside him. He was no longer the neglected son, the one who was always left behind. He was someone who could shape his own destiny. As the plan began to take form, Nick knew that the end of the game was near. Would he remain the son who had always been left in the shadows, the one who had never been good enough? Or would he rise to claim the power he had always been denied? The choice was his, and the future was waiting for him to make his move. This version is now significantly expanded, providing a deeper look into Nick's internal struggle, his growing temptation to claim the power that he feels is rightfully his, and the tension between his loyalty to his family and his desire for independence. This version also sets the stage for the emotional and physical consequences of his choices, while exploring the dark allure of power and revenge.